As you can see, this is joint work with Gianluca Violante and Costas Meghir. Costas is here. And this is what I'm going to present is a set of results that are not final. And this will be just an illustration of what we are trying to do with this. They are, in fact, the nth iteration of this embarrassingly long project, which we hope will be able to close relatively soon. So what's the motivation? Well, there is an increasing realization of the importance to look at policy intervention within equilibrium frameworks, right? And this realization comes from the fact that there are some shortcomings of simply using kind of short-term data techniques that look at changes 1 year before and 1 year after. And I'll try to give you some details about these shortcomings. Our aim here is to provide such a framework and to look at both the aggregate and distributive effects of the policies. And the crucial premise is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in the world, and it takes different shapes. And one of them is ability. Now, if there is one takeaway I would like to give you, if there is one thing I would like you to remember of this presentation when everything is done, is that the interaction of heterogeneity and price effects, equilibrium effects, can be large even when these price effects are small. In other words, even if I take a stand and say, there is a whole range of estimates of the elasticity of substitution, say, between different skills, even if I take the highest possible elasticity of substitution in the literature, as long as I model heterogeneity carefully, general equilibrium effects matter. So this is pretty much the takeaway. There is an addendum to this takeaway. Not only the interaction of heterogeneity and price effects is powerful, even when price effects are not very large, in fact, of the order of less than 1%. But these equilibrium effects work through interesting mechanisms, and if we internalize, particularly when we look at education policy, at college financing, if we internalize the way parents respond to these equilibrium effects, things get even more interesting, okay? So there's a lot of heterogeneity, and we know that ability is one of them. Now, however, a youth's ability is not a completely random variable. We know it depends on parental ability. In fact, if I can, okay. What this table reports is AFQT quintiles of mothers in the NLSY 79, and these are PIAT math scores. There are different types of scores for kids, and we did this for different age groups, trying to control for age. And so this basically tells you what share of mothers, what share of kids are in the first quintile of the kids' ability distribution if their moms are in the first quintile, and so on. So you can see one thing that appears from this table is that the main diagonal has relatively large entries. Now, so in a way, there is persistence of ability over time. Now, not only that, so parents not only endow you or give you a better draw, let's say, in the ability lottery, but they also make inter-vivos transfers. Okay? So this is why I said like the new iteration. This paper was circulated in previous versions, but we were dissatisfied with certain aspects of the way we were modeling the financing, so we took a step back and we tried to go back to the data and model the credit markets in a very careful way. So one thing to keep in mind is that a large chunk of education financing is cash that you get from your family. And these inter-vivos transfers are decisions, presumably optimal decisions made by parents, forward-looking parents, based on labor market opportunities, credit constraints, and arguably the ability of the child and the ability of the parent himself. Like they are basically comparing streams of income and deciding how to allocate resources. So transfers from parents are important. Now, what we do is the following. We develop an heterogeneous agents framework that with intergenerational ability, persistence, and transfers. This is nothing fancy. It's like just your garden variety heterogeneous agents model. We evaluate the effects of policy interventions in equilibrium, focusing on education policy, so college subsidies. And I'll give you like just a conditional grant. In fact, I will show you that the model does reasonably well in reproducing the kind of elasticity of response in enrollment that has been estimated in the reduced form microliterature. And we ask whether the effects, the equilibrium effects induced by policy interventions are relevant. We find that, okay, as I said at the very beginning, if there is one takeaway from this talk, is that there are general equilibrium effects and they work in interesting ways, and they're quantitatively important because of this heterogeneity. And as I said before, they are triggered by very small changes in marginal returns. You don't need a lot of change in the marginal return to education to trigger these effects. Now, why is this interesting? Well, there is this is a huge literature. The education policy literature is very large, and the policy evaluation is widely used by governments now. So, like some papers like Oportunidades and Progresa in Mexico, the education maintenance allowance in the UK, JTPA in the US. These are all kind of government intervention aimed at getting people to stay in school, for example, in the case of the EMA in high school. So various techniques have been developed to evaluate the effects of these interventions. And the gold standard is something that technically we borrow from the medical literature, right? There is a control and a treatment group, and it's a randomized small-scale field experiments in which treatment and control are compared, and these are kind of ex-ante identical guys. So we do like what they do when they test medicines, ideally. So when field trials are not feasible, then we kind of resort to quasi-experimental techniques, which are essentially ways to implement this through kind of cleverly designed tricks, like diff-in-diff, matching, IV. They are all variation of the same thing. Okay, so now, some issues in policy evaluation. Well, one thing is to say, okay, I want to evaluate the effect of this medicine. I can kind of check this, but I might want to see what's the effect of the medicine 10 years from now or 15 years from now. So there might be long-term effects, and it takes time for them to show up. So if I really want to assess the effectiveness of a policy, I might actually, I need a method that allows me to assess these long-term effects. Then there are other things like the effects on the non-treated. We know that one of the identifying assumptions of most of these evaluation methods is that there is no effect on the untreated. But apart from the fact that there is some evidence of violations of these, we know that there might also be other concurring effects when the policy is put in place. And then there is another issue has to do with the scale of the experiment. There might be small-scale field experiments might be all we can get financed for, or might be all we can be able to do. But that doesn't mean that when we roll out these policies, the large-scale effects will be comparable. And another thing is that it's very hard to account separately for the effect of non-heterogeneity vis-a-vis uncertainty. And people in this room have studied that. And all of these bullet points in different ways are often ignored in the applied literature. This is what I'm trying to underline here. So finally, the equilibrium effects may affect prices. Now, some people say that these price effects are so small that, for all practical purposes, we are okay using the methods I described before. But I want to show you that that's not true, and it's not true in very, very, very misleading ways. In other words, certain things might not change in aggregate, but when we scrape below the surface, the composition effects that are induced by these small price changes are substantial. Okay? So this is the framework we use. It's maybe I should put. I can barely see that. So this is a basic OLG life cycle model with endogenous labor supply, education, interview of transfer choices. Heterogeneity is in initial wealth, which is basically an endowment you receive from your parents. Ability, which to a certain extent is correlated with your parents, and labor efficiency. And we allow for endogenous price responses through an aggregate production technology with heterogeneous labor inputs. Okay? Let's call them skills or education levels. As a matter of fact, it's a more appropriate way to describe them. And then we design numerical experiments, and we examine how different policies affect different peoples in different ways. So this is just to give you an idea of what the budgets for education are. I'll just skip on this. I have only 45 minutes. There are large costs involved in education policies. In fact, actually, in developed countries, they account for roughly 1/20 of government expenditure in a given year. So in many cases, more than that. That's probably a lower bound. So what we find? So we find just just to give you an idea of, if I don't reach the end of the talk, like we find that policy outcomes are sensitive to small changes in marginal returns. Subsidies are able to change aggregate education distribution in partial equilibrium when prices are held constant, but the aggregate effects basically disappear once we allow for equilibrium effects. In fact, when we allow for very conservative equilibrium effects. However, even in GE, there are substantial composition effects. So even when if we were to look at the effects of a policy from the aggregate point of view, after taking into account equilibrium effects, one might think like there's nothing going on. In reality, lots of things have changed. And another thing we find is that these equilibrium effects work through interesting crowding out effects of inter-vivos transfers. Now, these crowding out transfers are unequally distributed across the wealth distribution in the population. And what I'll try to show you, I did this last night. I didn't know, this is just one possible way to do it. Probably there are better ways to do it. I will run a regression of the, if you want, the displacement of the inter-vivos transfer due to the change in grants. And I'll show you that the crowding out is increasing in the wealth of the parents. In other words, if you are not careful how you design this program, you might just simply putting money in the hands of people who don't really need it, whose kids are inframarginal to the education decision, whose income is relatively high, and so on and so forth, okay? So I guess this, together with the equilibrium effects, is the other takeaway from the paper, at least today. So what are the education decisions? How do we model education decision? Well, it's a cost-benefit analysis that kids make. Like the costs are that education costs money, time, and effort, and the returns are that you can access a labor spot market with higher wages. So this is really a ticket to a better job market, a job market that pays you better per hour. Heterogeneity. There are individual returns that depend on ex-ante ability and ex-post labor shocks. So people are different ex-ante, but they also live different lives in terms of labor market shocks. And there are 3 education levels. Let's call them high school dropouts, high school graduates, and college graduates. And each education is a way to smooth, education basically is just an alternative way to smooth marginal utility of consumption over the life cycle. It's just like assets. It's, if you want, it's a portfolio choice. Okay, so this is a standard neoclassical model. There is discrete finite lifetime, 16 to 95. We model perfect annuity markets, so simplify things in retirement, popularly stationary population, and we give agents pension flows that when they retire. Utility is also standard, depends on consumption and leisure. There is a discount factor beta. Schooling implies some additive utility cost k theta, which varies with agent's ability. And this, if you want, is what some people in this room who've written this literature called psychic cost of education. Basically, there is an underlying puzzle why people don't accumulate more human capital given the returns. In fact, actually, one of the papers today, the paper by Mark Haggett, might actually provide a partial explanation of the psychic utility cost if we use a different way of discounting future flows of income. So, and then we incorporate also intergenerational ability transmission. Ability of youth depends on parental ability and luck, okay? So agents choose consumption, education, transfers, and labor supply. Labor supply is important here. I don't have time to get into the details, but it's an endogenous choice in this model. And there are separate spot markets by education. And what are the inputs on the production technology? Well, the production technologies takes as inputs aggregate physical capital and aggregate human capital. And they are aggregated using a simple Cobb-Douglas aggregator. But then human capital is itself the aggregation of 3 efficiency-weighted aggregate labor supply by education. 1, it's high school dropouts. 2 is high school graduates, and 3 is college graduates. And of course, there is a fair amount of disagreement on how large or how small this row should be, because it's what drives the general equilibrium effects. continuing with the economic environment, there are initial resources, and the youth starts life with inter vivos transfers chosen by parents. And this is, in this iteration of the paper, we kind of said, okay, if we want to model inter vivos, we got to do it quite carefully. So we use in LSY data, we try to measure the present discounted value of transfers around education, during the education, up to the end of the college period. And we try to get a model which reproduces these several features, in fact, of this transfers distribution. Labor efficiency is, so what is the wage of an individual I in education E? When we log linearize it, is basically like the marginal product of the production technology, we call it WE, plus a function of individual ability theta I with a gradient lambda that we also estimate from an LSY data. Some polynomial in age, let's call it psi j of education, which changes by education, and then an idiosyncratic shock that is persistent, which we model as an AR1, okay? Markets are competitive, and workers can self-insure by holding risk-free asset A. And there is an exogenous borrowing limit, and during college, there are means-tested availability of subsidized loans. So we said, okay, if we want to actually study how credit markets and inter vivos kind of family transfers interact in the determination of access to financing of education, we got to kind of be careful also to distinguish between the different credit markets that are available. In the United States, we call them Stafford-like. Stafford's loans are not the only type of loans that is subsidized by the government, but they are by far the largest, and they account for a large, I mean, this is an extremely large program. In fact, it's means tested, but quite generous. Basically, the rich don't get it. Everybody else, almost everybody else gets it. So, government.
Giovanni, are you only allowing the means tested subsidized part, or there's also the unsubsidized component that everybody qualifies?
No, we are allowing for everything actually. So we kind of take the sum, and we allow for the whole chunk of it. So the government has revenues from proportional taxation of labor and assets income. Taxation of labor is denoted tau n, taxation of asset income tau k, and then this is spent in non-valued expenditure. And we also define government transfers as G, AJ, theta. AJ is asset at HJ, and theta is ability. So technically, this transfer is like a grant you can receive when you enroll in college. Might depend on your asset level or your ability level. So it can be means tested or ability tested or a mixture of the two. What I'll present today is results for the means tested grants. So recursive problem. So there are different stages in the life cycle in this problem. Okay, I'll start from the end of the life cycle, and I'll work my way through the beginning, just to make it clear how it works. So this is the work stage after a parent, an altruistic parent, makes an inter vivos transfer. Wj is the value of working at Hj, is education, A asset, theta is ability, Z is the current idiosyncratic shock, and this is basically the maximum of the standard 2-period Bellman representation, where this is the continuation value. This is subject to labor income, asset income, expenditure. We assume that there is a borrowing limit, and idiosyncratic shocks follow a random process, okay? AR1 in this case. So this is the more interesting period of inter vivos transfers. So now, the first chunk here is pretty much what I showed you before. The second chunk has 2 additional bits. Well, there's a second chunk and a third chunk, actually. The second chunk is basically the value function in which, with a certain weight omega 0, a parent internalizes the utility of the child. Okay? So this is really altruism in the sense of, the parent is partly living the continuum. If omega was 1, this would be a purely dynastic problem. Okay? And then we have this other term. This is a warm glow. This is a joy of giving kind of term, with 3 more parameters. Now, why both? Well, if we want to be careful about capturing the distribution of inter vivos transfers at the beginning, so at the beginning of the life cycle, there are a variety of moments. And initially, a previous iteration didn't have this term. But there was no way that this kind of altruism could replicate the features, all the nuances of that distribution. So we kind of needed more parameters, so we are using both, and we are calibrating them jointly, okay? So this is subject to what? Standard income side. On the expenditure side, there is an additional term that is what I give to my child here as a parent. And that's it for this bit. This is the work stage period before interviews. One thing I would like you to notice is that the transfer here depends, of course, on the ability of the child. Okay? So the ability is known at the time of transfer. We assume that.
Do all parents have just one child?
Yes. There's no fertility choice. And this is the work stage before interviews transfer. So in this work stage, what you get is the parent is kind of as a continuation value that now includes an expectation on the child ability. Now, this expectation is not kind of an expectation that without priors. The parent knows his or her own ability and forms a conditional expectation on the child ability. But we assume that up to the point the transfer is made, there is no knowledge of the real ability of the child, just a conditional expectation. The rest is relatively standard, with one exception. If you look at this term is basically the repayment of the parents, if you want, Stafford loans, okay? Or government subsidized loans. So we assume that in each period, this is a bit like a mortgage. In each period, you repay a certain part of your loan up until you extinguish your government loan. And if you, that's it. There's no, so basically we reduce. So in the first period of working life, the value function is the same for all workers. However, so this is how we model this kind of government loans. Government loans are basically modeled with they have a particular borrowing limit and a particular interest rate. And the interest rate is different from the interest rate you get on the private market. There is a discount to it, okay? And which will be calibrated again to kind of match features of the actual uptake of these loans, okay? So what are the education decision? For college, what you get is like that the value of going to college is basically value of consumption. We assume that there is only a fixed amount of leisure you can consume, a continuation value of being a college student, and the psychic cost that we use to match the aggregate enrollment rates in the economy. And then this is the conditional value of going to college. Of course, there is an unconditional choice between going to college and going to work as a high school graduate. So you will be a W worker with a high school degree. And
are you assuming that everybody who goes to college finishes college?
yes. That's an assumption that we are making. Like we are restricting. There is no dropping out. So it is a strong assumption. I know that that's definitely not the case. No, it's there is dropping out.
The completion rate is about 60%.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true, and we basically try to step aside from what determines whether you complete or not college. There are other studies that actually focus on that. What we are trying to do here is kind of focus on the aspect that has to do with access to education, no exit from education. That could actually be due partly also to shocks, to financial incentives. This is something that we don't address. So what we are trying to kind of write here, what I wrote here is the budget constraint for a person who's in college. Okay, so what you get here is the expenditure, your savings and your consumption. Then you may or may not have some income from assets, or like some interest that is due because you borrowed a hat. There is phi that is the direct cost of going to college. There is some transfer G that you get from the government. So this is the borrowing constraint. This is the budget constraint if you have positive assets. The budget constraint, if you actually have negative assets, is given by this, where you don't actually pay while in college any interest on the loan. You will pay later this kind of mortgage-like repayment over a fixed schedule. But while in college, you basically accumulate just that debt, okay? Up to the borrowing limit minus B. Okay, so there is also a different budget constraint that is more simple for the people who don't qualify for government loans. For these guys, all they can do, these are the rich guys, if you want. These are the guys who get large inter-vivos transfers from their rich families. These guys actually have access to private credit markets and not to Stafford loans. So this is their simpler budget constraint. So then what we do with this? We define a stationary equilibrium. It's just a standard recursive competitive equilibrium. And then we go to parameterize the model, okay? Now, the model is parameterized in different steps. It's a relatively rich model. So first, we assign or estimate values for what? For the earning process, so wage equations, distribution of abilities, for which we use the NLSY 79 and the transition law that I've showed you before. The aggregate technology, we use actually our own estimates from CPS and PSID. We get a range of the elasticity of substitution between different human capital aggregates between 1.4 and 3.1. Just to give you an idea of what this elasticity means is that I think that Heckman, Lochner, and Taber got something around 1.4 as a matter of fact, or 1.5. I'm not sure about the exact number. Card and Lemieux in their QJ paper suggest an elasticity between skills of a maximum elasticity between skills of around 3 again. Although the elasticity about between age groups is larger, is I think 5 in that paper. But between skills is 3. So what we get is a range that seems reasonable from these estimates. And then what we do in the experiments I'll show you today, we take the higher end. We take the 3.1 elasticity, which is high. And I'll show you that the equilibrium effects are there. And then the other crucial thing, that this is something that we worked on a lot recently, is that there are some basic features of the distribution of inter-vivos transfers, like mean, median, conditional on parental income, and so on and so forth. We kind of try to capture all of those things. In fact, actually, I have 15 minutes, but I think it's worth the time. This is the last, if you want this, like the model estimation. So it's over-identified. We have more moments than parameters, and we kind of calibrate like private borrowing limit, discount factor. This is like the difference between the borrowing and lending rate in the private market. This is actually the subsidized borrowing rate from the Stafford-like loans. This is the borrowing limit. These are, by the way, the moments that we are trying to match. And then there are all these things about inter-vivos. We do match the average inter-vivos transfer of first income quartile. These are families, inter-vivos and so on, like by some also one by wealth quartiles and so on. So what we are trying to do is kind of give a fair shot to the, yes?
Is there an interaction between the inter-vivos transfer and tuition and whether the kids go to college or not?
Okay. Okay. So yeah. So I've been asked if there is an interaction between the inter-vivos transfer and college tuitions, and so there is in the model there is no direct interaction modeled as such. What's there is an interaction, of course, between inter-vivos transfers and access to, for example, subsidized credit, or no access to subsidized credit. Or in the model, one other thing that I should mention, we are also quite careful to kind of reproduce the kind of access to grants that people get, not subsidized loans. On top of subsidized loans, people also get grants, and they are means tested. So we reproduce all these grants by brackets. So, of course, in that sense, there is an indirect link, I guess. I'm not sure that was the question. Between inter-vivos, the optimal inter-vivos decision and the kind of finance these guys get from families, from government, from different sources.
So what assets, sir? This is just the assets question, summing assets in the NLSY.
What's asset?
In the data, assets.
It's net worth. In the NLSY, we use the net worth. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we can actually split people in quartiles, and we look at how the interview transfers. In the appendix of the paper, actually, there are the actual figures in dollars. So then what we do two things. We first compute a benchmark at steady state equilibrium, and then we validate the benchmark in different ways. So we look at life cycle profiles. For example, we look at the variance of earnings and variance of consumption over the life cycle, and we compare it to the existing literature. For example, Torres-Lett and Telmer and Yaron. We do exactly the same picture as they do. Works fine. We also look at, there's a recent paper by Katz and Goldin on inequality in America. It's also a book, I think. And we ran some of the exact same regressions that they ran to make sure that the kind of inequality, the dummies that we have in the simulated data have numerical values that are similar to theirs, and they do. So, and then another important one, this was a recent one, because I think Gianluca was presenting it somewhere, and actually a PhD student said, yeah, well, there is all this literature on the enrollment response on to 1,000, I don't know why, the magic number is $1,000. Everybody expresses this in $1,000. In fact, there is a paper by Thomas Kane in which actually reports in the appendix a table with all the different estimates of the enrollment response in college to a change in $1,000 in the actual cost of going to college. And that number varies, depending on the estimate, between like, say, 2% and actually Kane has a large number, 8% or like something like, his largest estimate is 8 or something. And I think we get something like 5.5% or so. These are all kind of, if you want, robustness checks on how well the model is doing in terms of inequality and in terms of enrollment responses and so on. So then we do two things. I think I'll just present one of them because I have 10 minutes. But first, so the idea, I mean, you can do lots of things. In fact, a previous iteration of this work had lots of different experiments that now have been scrapped since now it's a completely different model. But what I'll present today is just a conditional grant. So we study a grant which gives $1,000 to everybody, conditional on going into education, in addition to whatever grant people were already receiving in the benchmark, and in addition to whatever Stafford-like loans they were receiving, they had access to. So there are two bits to this. First, I actually want to show you what I did yesterday evening. This might actually not be the best way to do it, but I think it illustrates the point about crowding out well. So we have a bunch of simulated data in the benchmark and in the experiment, right? And so what I can do, I can actually take the same people and look at the log change in the grant they've received, and then look at the log change in the interviews transfer that they've received. This is, by the way, this is the general equilibrium outcome, okay? So this is after every other adjustment. The economy is different in general equilibrium. Then what I do, I first kind of regress for everybody, not just for college students, for everybody in this sample, the log change in grant, so the log change in IVT, in interviews transfer, over the log change in grant and the constant. And this gives me a value of minus 0.25. So if there was no change in grant, this would be the change. And this is purely due to the general equilibrium, other general equilibrium effects in the economy, this constant, okay? But with no change in grant, you would get this change only. So this is basically, if you want, is a measure of crowding out overall. Then if I look at actual students, only people in college, the effect on average is larger. Then I do another thing, like forget about this column that I don't think is very informative. Anyway, the result doesn't change much from here. I introduce two dummies, one for being in the wealth quartile 1, lowest possible wealth, and one for being in wealth quartile 4, highest possible wealth, okay? And I estimate the same thing just on college goers, allowing for differences in intercept and differences in slope. And if you look at the difference in slope, there is almost full, well, I think it's actually full. There is full crowding out of the transfer for the rich parents. So in other words, like a policy like this, it's not very effective for the buck, I don't think. Now, how do things look like? Then let's go back to the effect, to the equilibrium effects here. Now, this is what I said at the beginning. If there is one thing I would like you guys to remember is that even if things don't look like changing a lot after general equilibrium effects take place, they do. Now, what I report here, there are 5 ability quintiles, okay? These are pretty much model equivalents of what is measured in the NLSY. And these are enrollment in high school and college for each of these ability quintiles. And the omitted category, high school dropouts. So there are 22% of people in ability being 1 in the baseline that are high school graduates, 1% are college graduates, the remainder are high school dropouts. As you can see, in ability 5, the figures are very different, right in the baseline. 54% are high school graduates, 45% are college graduates, the remainder are high school dropouts. So this is the benchmark, and this is the aggregate, when I aggregate overall ability groups. So now, I introduced this subsidy, $1,000, because it's the magic number, and I want to compare it to what other people have been doing. And I look at the partial equilibrium. So there are 2 flavors of partial equilibrium. There is one partial equilibrium that we call partial equilibrium surprise. This is a partial equilibrium in which we look at what basically much of the labor literature looks at, one period after response, assuming actually that people have been surprised by the policy change. So we don't allow human capital aggregates to converge. We do allow for that in what we call partial equilibrium convergence. This is also a partial equilibrium. By the way, partial equilibrium here means simply that the returns to schooling, the returns to education and the interest rate are held constant. All prices are constant, okay? But the difference between these two is that here, this is kind of, if you want a short-term response, this can be a longer-term response. For example, you can think of this as a small-scale kind of experiment in an area where it, other things can change, and we wait until these other things settle. In particular, the convergence criterion here is human capital aggregates, okay? When human capital aggregates converge, we call it an equilibrium, and it's a partial equilibrium because the prices are the same as in the baseline. Then we allow prices to respond without, though, allowing taxes to respond, because keep in mind that when the policy is introduced, there is a cost to it. Or this cost could actually be negative, so it could be a benefit. You might actually raise more revenues than you have to pay for the policy. This will have an effect on taxes. We allow for this effect in what we call the general equilibrium with labor tax adjustment, okay? So if you look at the actual enrollment rates here, the response is very large in partial equilibrium, right? In fact, the partial equilibrium convergence, when we allow families to become richer, to make more transfer, and so on and so forth, is even stronger than in the partial equilibrium surprise. This is just an illustration of the long-term effects that we have in mind. At the beginning of the talk, I said one of the things that we cannot really do with the standard approach is to kind of assess the long-term effectiveness of the policy. So if we live in a world where there is no response, there is no feedback from the policy, we would get large increases in enrollment. Now, we move to general equilibrium. The enrollment rate in college is almost unchanged from the benchmark. There is almost no difference in aggregate. Now, at the beginning I said, well, one has to be a bit careful because if I was an econometrician and I was just doing the before and after aggregate response to the policy, I would say this policy is poor. But if then I go and try to look at the distribution of skills here and in the baseline, they are very different. Like, if you look at the enrollment rates, much of the response is actually in the higher ability guys. Whereas for the lower ability guys, there is actually some decrease, like for example, for these guys or for these guys. So what's happening here? This is a really relatively standard effect that it's by no means unique to this. It's actually very common in the entrepreneurship literature. I'll give you that example because it's very intuitive. Suppose that people are different in terms of entrepreneurial skills and in terms of access to credit markets. If I have an equilibrium in which some of the high ability entrepreneurs are credit constrained, they might not be able to become entrepreneurs, they'll be workers. The moment I release the borrowing constraint on that, the more skilled entrepreneurs will get in, they are more productive, they're more efficient, they'll drive down prices, and they'll kick out the guys who were entrepreneurs in the benchmark, but at lower ability. So this kind of crowding out effect is exactly what's taking place here. Now, another thing to notice is that in this framework, if I didn't say why a government would like to put a policy like this. We have some welfare analysis. I don't present it here, but we are abstracting from the reason for this policy. If one of the reasons was to reduce inequality, like often in newspapers you read, we should have better access to education that will reduce inequality. Well, this kind of sorting is actually going to increase inequality over the long term. You are basically sorting more skilled people to higher paying jobs. So you got to be careful what you wish for. And as you can see, much of the effect, what I report here, is actually the average ability of workers and the percentage change from the baseline for these guys. And as you can see in general equilibrium, there is an increase in the ability for the college graduates and a decrease for the other two groups. So we also did another thing, but I'm out of time. So we try to check how things differ where we spend the same kind of budget on loans policies. We find that, strangely enough, somebody before said that it's isomorphic to have changes in interest rate or borrowing limits. That's not what we find. We find that there is a difference between the two, and not in this particular experiment, but I'm out of time. So what are the conclusions? Well, in partial equilibrium, subsidies seem to be effective in increasing college enrollment and output. And that would be an ideal world. Lots of things get better. In general equilibrium, though, subsidies are quite ineffective in aggregate. There are very little changes in terms of aggregate schooling choices once you account for these equilibrium effects. And as I said before, these equilibrium effects are associated to very, very small changes in marginal products, in prices. A change of less than 1%, given the right amount of heterogeneity, has very large effects. Looking at aggregate outcomes, though, can be misleading. Although there is no change in aggregate at the aggregate level, price changes can induce improvements in ability composition among college graduates in GE. In other words, if you scratch below the surface, what looks like no change in aggregate is actually a lot of change at the micro level. So there's a large efficiency gain. These results are robust to specification of aggregate technology and to alternative policy intervention. In fact, actually here I'm using an extremely large elasticity of substitution, much larger than, as I said before, the Heckman, Lochner, and Tabor number, and on a par on the estimate of Cardin Lemieux. There is substantial crowding out of private savings by the subsidy, especially among the rich. As I showed you in that regression 2 or 3 slides before, if you take into account the response in transfers given to the kids by forward-looking parents to this change in policy, you are basically, if you design the policy like this simple kind of conditional grant, you are putting money in the hands of rich people who don't really need it. Their kids are inframarginal to the intervention. They're just going to reduce the transfer to their kids. And that's all.
So I decided to discuss this paper because I was very excited about it, so I wanted to force myself to read it. It's a very ambitious analysis. I think Giovanni did a good job to explain what is a rich and complicated model. As he said, you can choose not to finish high school, you can complete high school, or you can invest in education. And there are costs to education. Some are foregone earnings, some are just tuition costs, and some are psychic costs. So, these are ingredients that others have looked at, and a less ambitious researcher might have been happy to start introducing 1 or 2 new features, but we have 4 important contributions here, okay? One is endogenous labor supply. The other one is agents heterogeneity, and obviously the first 2 interact in an interesting way because you have a permanent ability level and an insurable efficiency shock. So one is ex ante and the other one is an ex post kind of heterogeneity, and your labor supply might change depending on these 2 important factors, so there is an interesting interaction there. And then this is a completely new ball game. And obviously, you have shown that these transfers are large and are important. And actually, it would have been nice to have even more time to show how large these transfers are, even though I thought Carl's previous work shows that these transfers are typically underreported because people remember what they give, but don't remember as much what they receive. Okay, so these transfers might be even more than what we have in the data, and they are already large, even if underreported. So I'm particularly excited about introducing these two new aspects. One is the model starts at high school age. So, many important features of early childhood education are not addressed, but at least there is an initial condition, and it's partly genetic and partly early childhood and investment up to high school. So this is very important to have. And then this is a very exciting and important contribution. The parents can choose how to give transfers to the children before they go to college. So this is an important source of funds that eases any kind of liquidity constraints. So it's somewhat unsurprising that, if the government does more to ease liquidity constraints, the parents can afford to do less. But it's a very important channel to examine quantitatively in a framework. So it's not super easy to discuss this paper in 5 minutes because it's very rich, and the authors just got to adding some new features. So we have some important results, but we don't have all of the results we would want, because when you make such a big investment in a complicated model, you would really want to understand what is making the model work, what is driving what, and that takes a lot of time, especially with such a rich framework. So as Giovanni said, we have some initial results, and they are interesting, but I think the challenge for the authors is to really tease out all of the results we might care about efficiency, about welfare, from this model. The first result was already stressed by Heckman, Lochner, and Tabor, and it's the one you explained well. When you are in general equilibrium, the returns to education change, and so typically the outcomes are much more muted than you would have in partial equilibrium. Usually investment decisions are very sensitive to returns. In addition, you have a lot of selection in this model going on that is also important when you look at general equilibrium effects. So it's an important message, but it's not new. So, with a big investment, you need a big return, and you have made a big investment. The other important result is, and that's where, given my interest in the intergenerational dynamics, you find that there is subsidization from government crowds out private transfers, and you have shown some results, and I really encourage you to do even more, because I think this is very important. So my punchline for the paper is that it's very promising, and I look forward to seeing more results. So why am I stressing so much that I think you should make an effort to make what is going on more clear? There are several reasons. One, understanding what drives the model is going to help you design better policy that could address the frictions, right? For example, you have borrowing constraints, you have labor market risk, you have lack of insurance against children's ability, right? It would be interesting to see, for example, what happens in your basic framework with inheritance of ability with the children and one without, to understand how important that force is. Maybe, that is an important indication of how maybe we should think of policies that affect that initial conditions, okay? And, part of Lance's job and mine is trying to bring this group together and create future cooperation. So the more complicated your framework is, the more it's going to be hard for other people to build on your model. And I think you can have some very important messages for other people building other models on what of all of the features you have we should really have, right? Because I put up your 4 most recent contributions, but you have private loan markets, public loan markets. You have a bunch of wrinkles in the model that make it hard maybe to understand what we should really consider first order. In terms of future work, when we look at the data, you also point out some things. In your paper, you mostly think about long run, and that's important. However, you also document how the cost of education has been changing every year for 30 years. So if we had a simpler model, I think yours is a rich model, and I don't want to add more things, but if we had your model stripped down, we could then look at other things. For example, what happens when we keep increasing the cost of education, or what happens over the next 5 or 10 years when we have a credit crisis to college enrollment and the labor market, or if there is persistent unemployment, what happens to education choices, or even aging of the population. I don't by any means encourage you to complicate the model. I'm simply saying that if we were to strip out other features that you don't find to be first order, we could maybe look at the formation of that initial condition in early childhood. Okay, and I'm opening the floor for other comments. Lance?
I think you guys have a fantastic model to think about a lot of interesting stuff, but what you've your simulations so far are really, I think, kind of boring, in the sense that you've got all this uncertainty, you've got labor supply and all these issues. That has almost nothing. That's probably playing almost no role in. Yeah. But I mean, I think I would focus on the new features of what you guys are adding, which I think the uncertainty and the labor supply make it much more interesting to think about other types of policies in terms of providing insurance against bad labor market outcomes, what the trade-offs are going to be in terms of labor supply if you provide too much insurance, income contingent loans, these kinds of things, I think is a much more interesting sort of path to go down than, is the partial equilibrium effect much bigger than the general equilibrium effect. Because I don't think, I'm not at all surprised that you find that the G effect wipes out almost all the partial equilibrium effect, because I wouldn't have expected all the extra bells and whistles you guys added and important features, but I wouldn't have expected much of that to affect what we found in our paper. Unless you have a presumption that somehow that would have changed. I think it's worth doing, but I think that's kind of the least interesting thing you could probably do with it, but maybe the starting point.
Other comments, questions?
I agree. This is a really fascinating thing you've done. And when you got through all of that work and came to the final bottom line, you found that the least educated were actually hurt in a general equilibrium result. That's a phenomenal finding, because if that's transmitted generationally, then much of what you tried to do, much society has to try to do through its grants and loans, has had the opposite of an intended effect. So if I misinterpreted that sort of final finding?
No, I think that's actually correct. Actually, it's not unusual to read in newspapers stuff like inequality has gone up and we should do, and more educated people make more money and we should educate more people. So inequality will go down, and that's a very misleading statement, I think, and it's a very common. So I think it's correct what you just said.
Now let me ask you, I'm not personally particularly troubled by, so to speak, income inequality, but I am troubled by a finding that the least, the people you were trying to help most by your subsidy programs,
they're crowded out.
Were crowded out, and actually, now are they worse off in an absolute sense, or worse off only in a relative sense in this final?
That's a question for the welfare analysis. No, so the reason why we didn't present, this was the only result we presented, is that this is, as I said, is the last iteration, so we scrapped all the previous results, and some of them might have been much more interesting, and I just presented what I felt like was I had some newer results. I'm not sure. I had to double check and make sure that they are robust and everything. So this was the one I kind of trusted, and I went for this. But yeah, that's the enormously
important sort of policy finding is, have you left this group of people worse off? They may No one's particularly
I
troubled.
think, okay, I can tell you, this is, don't quote me on this, but I did the welfare analysis. So I did it by ability, by tracking the same guy in the baseline and looking at the guy at the 25th percentile of ability, 75th, by parental wealth and so on and so forth. And yes, from the welfare point of view, these guys actually lose in absolute terms, not just relative. They're losers exposed in absolute terms. But
That's it.
this is
Very,
something that I would have to work on and control and make sure that this
it's a very important finding.
Costas, would you like
Yeah,
to add
so
something?
I just want to add to these two comments that are actually highly related. First of all, obviously there was quite a lot of work to make sure the thing is actually correct. We're really going to work on this risk issue, and this relates to the other question, because in some sense, what you want to figure out is ways of targeting policies in the right sort of way. Because don't forget, this simple policy that Giovanni presented here is basically a universal subsidy, and policy is just not going to be designed like that, at least not in the US, right? So what's going to happen is that we're going to, so if you look at the UK, what the UK does are income contingent repayment loans. So basically, if you get the loan, and well, if you're very poor, you get a grant. If you're otherwise, you get a loan, and then if you're unsuccessful, for example, by being unemployed or earning too little, you don't repay during that period, and eventually the loan is written off after an absolute number of 25 years. So these are kind of partial insurance type mechanisms that we would really like to look at. So kind of on the one hand, we would like to first of all discuss the implications that the model has, both in terms of intergeneration transfers and in terms of risk, which are kind of things that have not really been looked at. And the second, in terms of policy, we would like to try and see if we can design a policy that is going to be targeted in terms of improving the human capital investments of lower skill individual or middle skill individuals. And so you're not going to get the lowest ability people in college, and it wouldn't make much sense. I think that's where early childhood development programs would have traction. But you might think of policies that would encourage the middle ability groups to participate more, and designing kind of efficient mechanisms to get these people in and see if you can really improve welfare. And there is, of course, scope for improving welfare, because if we go back to the ability transition matrix that Giovanni showed in the beginning, the top right corner is the kind of interesting policy target. These are the bright kids of low ability families and low wealth families. So the key question is, can one find policy instruments to get these guys into college? And you can see that there can be efficiency improvements because they are liquidity constrained, almost certainly, because their parents cannot give them the right amount of transfers. They are high ability, so they will have high returns. And of course, on the other hand, they have access to some government loans. So, but what role does risk play and partial insurance there? So these are the kind of interactions we want to look at. But before we do kind of such intricate things like that, it better be that the model can replicate two things. First of all, the reduced form results and the natural experiment results that we've seen in the literature on the effects of subsidizing people to go to college, and that we've achieved. We more or less get that kind of elasticity, a bit on the high side, but not particularly. And secondly, that economically, all the mechanisms are there. So, for example, you want to see this crowding out. You want to see it happening. Otherwise, there may be, the program may not be working. So, before we get into more intricate stuff, we must we had to make sure that things are working. Yeah.